Hi, we're the Qemists. Welcome back to our studio in Brighton, and we're going to continue taking you through the track Run You. Okay, so we move on to kind of the guitars and the guitar amp sounds used for Run You, and kind of most of the album, really. Yeah, so it's done in a different project. I kind of, rather than take you into the actual recording project, which is really messy and contains lots of edits and things like that, I'd show you this project, which is essentially the stems of that project. It's a clean DI out from one of these guitars. I think it's this black PRS here, which these are the two guitars I use to play live, and they're the same guitars we use in the studio. It just makes sense in terms of sonics to have the same sounding gear in the studio and live. And they're really good guitars, great to play. So on to the amp sounds, really, which is kind of the crucial element. We use Amplitube. In this project, we are using Amplitube 3, but we have now kind of moved on to using Amplitube 4, and when we play live, I quite often use Mesa Boogie amps, and they've got a great Mesa Boogie amp emulation within Amplitube, which is probably one of the best ones out there at the moment. I've been told to check out Bias Effects, but for the moment we're kind of sticking with Amplitube. And in this we've got two orange amps with different settings. One's got a load of mid in it, and one has got a load of mid scooped out of it. We've got no stomps in there at all. It's running in stereo. Two different cabs. Got a 2x12 orange, 4x12 orange, bit of compression, and then to the output. And so that's our stereo mix. Now you can see that down here everything's panned hard left and hard right. And kind of going back to what Leon had been saying about the stereo image of guitars, to create that rock feel you do need heavy stereo guitars. They need to be panned hard left and hard right. But there is a method that I'll show you in a second that allows for mono compatibility, which is you know, as we've touched on, is extremely important. So this is what the guitar sounds like with no amp. So this is just coming from the guitar. Really plain and simple. I spend a lot of time, I'm not the best kind of technical guitar player, so I spend a lot of time editing. So in a way, it kind of sounds almost unnatural in its attack and its sort of tightness, but we're making dance music, so it needs to be tight. If it's kind of loose or it wavers around too much, we found that it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't sit right with everything that's kind of quite heavily programmed. So the guitar is edited in the same way. So that clean DI out, you could, and we have in the past, used other things. We've used a reamp box, like a radial reamp box, where you can take that signal out of the sound card and into an amp in a room and mic that up, or several amps, whatever you kind of want to do. But in terms of consistency, we wanted a sound that we could just dial up each time, and we know that that was the sound that sounded great on that record. Will it work on this one? Let's try it. And, you know, we don't have to go setting amps up and mics and trying to recreate a sound. I can load up Amplitube, and I know that that was the sound on the last record that we really liked. So you've got clean, and then into Amplitube. So it's fairly distorted, but in terms of, you know, metal or gent, it's pretty lean. Yeah, just straight orange amp sounds, really. Nothing really very clever about it. Different mics to give different sounds. So I think it's an SM57, and that's some sort of, yeah, it's a 421 on there. Just to give, again, a little more difference in the left and the right, and that helps thicken the stereo image. But yeah, if we were to just use that take and put that into the project, we would have problems with mono compatibility. So I've taken another take, re-recorded, edited in the same way, and we've got an amplitude that's set up in mono. If it decides to open, there we go. So you can see from the signal flow across the top that there's no other amp, it's just one amp, in and out, and it's mono. So if we flick, totally mono. And again, that will be a slightly different amp sound, just to create a slight... The more variations in harmonics and differences, the thicker things get, certainly with guitars. So that will be a different take with a different amp sound, but absolutely 100% mono. So when you combine them, you get this. So when we flick to mono, the hard left and right does disappear, but you've got quite a consistent version of the left and right dead in the center in mono, which is really, really important. And then we chuck in against the track. Yeah, and that's the basics of how we will record guitar for our tracks. All right, so we're going to take a little look at the vocals and where they started for Run You. It was one of the earliest sessions that we had done with Ollie, probably the second, it might have even been the first vocal session that we'd ever done. Took a couple of days over it with the writing and stuff, and was done in our old studio, which was across the road, which is a real kind of shoebox. So yeah, it was hard, really hard in that studio to kind of get a good recording. We've got a great mic. We use one of these, so if anyone's in any doubt on getting a decent vocal mic, I tell you, this has made our lives infinitely easier. This is a Neumann U87. We used to hire them because they are pretty expensive. But in terms of, mixing and ending up with a good sounding vocal, a great mic and a great preamp is kind of essential, really. So there's the Focusrite ISA 430 over there, which has got good compression, EQ, de-essing. It's got pretty much everything on there that you want. Very clean, crisp, uncoloured preamp. It's not like a Neve 1073 or anything. It's very kind of, what you put in is what you get out. It's just very, not clinical, but crystal. But what we had as a problem with this, and you'll hear it a little bit, and as I go through the vocals, you'll see the EQ is like it is because I'm having to EQ and compensate for some element of the room. And that's the other major factor when you record vocals, is what room sound you're getting, how dead it is, how the mic is responding to the room. So if you're doing projects, spend time messing around, setting the mic up in different places, using different absorption or one of the new kind of mic shields or something like that to kind of get the best you can right off the bat, because it will make mixing and stuff later down the line so much easier. But yeah, so this project is the comp project of the vocal session, and I'm going to show you just some of the comps that we made from that session, which then get stemmed from this project and go into the master vocal mix project. So here we are with Ollie.
It doesn't matter what they say.
So we've got one main vocal there, and then we'll double track stuff. So
It doesn't matter what they say.
we've got another one there. In fact, in this we've quad tracked it.
I won't accept.
I know we haven't. That's just another line. So what we've done here is, because the lyrics or the ends of the words slightly overlap, we've recorded it in two separate ways so that we get it nice and clean. And
I won't accept it in any single way. I won't accept it in any single way.
and a double of that. So we get him to sing it more than once. don't tend to use too much synthetic doubling because you can kind of hear it. It's just much better if you can get the singer to give you another take. Not always easy, especially if it's at the end of a session and singers are worn out, their vocals are tired. So you kind of, when you approach a vocal session, you've got to kind of bear in mind all the different variations and takes that you want to get out of a singer before you start. So you don't go in hammering it and then they've got no voice left, or they haven't quite got enough energy to put in for the kind of harder stuff later down the line. So with singers, we tend to try and get a lot of variation, a lot of different layers. So we'll go, could you do it like this? Or could you drop it down an octave? And this is a good example. This is Ollie.
I won't accept it in any single way, and I
Kind of singing it much softer. It's lower down his register, and you know, it's a low vocal take, but you'll see how that adds a kind of thickening effect later on in the mix project. And then we've got harmonies over here.
regimented,
We've got 4 harmonies here.
regimented borders, 50,000 soldiers, anybody's order.
So that's just every other line, but harmonised. It's kind of 4 different harmonies in that, which we won't necessarily use all these things, but they're basically colours. They're giving us choice. So when we come to actually do the whole edit and sequence the vocal through the track, we've got choices about what layers can be put in or taken out, depending on what we think works. Because at this stage, most vocalists, not always the case, but certainly with a lot of the stuff we did with Ollie, he's singing to quite an early version of the track. The structure might not be there entirely, so we need to get a lot of material to work with. And then moving on, we did screams. Ollie's a good screamer, and
Regimented borders, we got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers. We don't do need to anybody's order.
yeah, and that's the kind of thing you need to plan, because that's going to take a lot out of his voice. He's technically very good, so he knows how to look after his voice, but you still need to plan it within a session. So yeah, and those are the main elements within Ollie's vocal. I think there may be a few
Don't let 'em run you.
a few kind of ad-lib things, and we always do that. We do, like, right at the end of the session, we'll just go, right, do whatever you want. We'll just run the sequencer and record it. And quite often we do get little gems of things that people do, and they're a bit more relaxed. They're not prepared to do it, so they just let go. And that's also a really important aspect of doing a successful vocal session, is to get the singer feeling comfortable and relaxed, so that they feel a bit freer to kind of experiment at times. I think it's really important that kind of happens. Yeah, and that's pretty much the result of a fairly long writing and recording session. And then we'll move on now to the mix. Right, so now we're going to take a little look at the vocal mix project. And some people may be wondering, why have you got a separate project to mix your vocals? Well, at the time we didn't have this computer, we didn't quite have the CPU to kind of do the proper mix on the vocals whilst being in the main sequencing project. And I guess that to some extent still rings true now, although we do have another studio that's got some UAD stuff in it, so there's a little bit of DSP offloading there that we can do, so we can do a bit more. But with very complex vocal mix projects, we'd still probably stick to having a separate project to mix vocals in. Another reason for doing it is that if we're working independently, I can get on with mixing vocals and making adjustments whilst the main project's mix moves forward, and I can just be sent some of the instrumentals. I can get an instrumental mix down, and then I can rebalance the vocals against where the project is at that moment. The only downside of doing that is that if you change the vocal in the main master project in terms of structuring or edits, I kind of have to then mimic that in the mix project, so that when I stem out the stems, they reflect the changes that have happened. But we're quite aware of it, so we try to kind of keep an eye on that and not go too mental. And if we do, then, you know, at the end of the day, I just have to recreate those edits in here. Right, so we talked about the different layers and vocal takes that we've got from Ollie, and within here you'll hear them
It doesn't matter what they say.
as they were, but with all the processing added. So what I'll do is I'll take the main vocals and I'll send them to a group. Everything gets grouped up, and we're in Cubase 8.5 for this because there's some legacy plugins that don't open in 9.5, but obviously everything we do now is, a lot of these legacy plugins we've kind of found a replacement for and have moved on from. But yeah, everything gets grouped up, and in Cubase 8.5 we still only had a limited amount of inserts, and that's why I've got, in most instances, a couple of vocal groups, because I ran out of slots. And the good people at Steinberg have now in 9.5 given us 16, which has made my life much easier in terms of having just one group for each selection of vocals. So let's take a look at the first group. Quite often I'll start with an RVox, just a very simple kind of compressor. There's a bit of kind of mystery about what goes on behind the scenes of this plugin, but I don't use the gate. I just use it for a bit of first leveling out of dynamics, and I just find it very easy. It works brilliantly on, it's a compressor designed around vocals, and generally it does what I need it to do. I will then go into a de-esser, mainly using the waves de-essers. I will use this one, or I'll use the Renaissance de-esser. And instead of kind of de-essing at the kind of upper end air frequency, quite often we'll de-ess at around 5K or 4K, because on sound systems, those frequencies in vocals, if they're in any way too loud, they cane your ears, and they just immediately switch people off records. It's just like, oh, that's just too much. So we're very mindful of that kind of frequency range in vocals, and de-essing. Sometimes we may even have another de-esser doing the very high end as well, but in this case we're just doing the sort of 5K. And it's not...
It doesn't matter what they say!
Because the mic it's very sheeny, it's very sort of high end. It is doing a fair amount in that area, just to kind of even it out and smooth it out, which, it's really important to make sure that that's done. And I find it better to have it in that order, to have a bit of compression than DS before going into an EQ, so that I'm just getting a kind of more level, even vocal before I start notching stuff out that perhaps I wouldn't need to notch out if I was putting the EQ first. So I leave the EQ sort of a little further down the chain so that some of the problems are taken care of before it hits the EQ. So my EQ of choice for vocals, and our choice really for kind of surgical cuts and corrective EQing is the FabFilter Pro Q. This is the Pro Q2, amazing EQ.
It doesn't matter what they say!
So you can see that I've rolled off the low end quite a lot. Sometimes if I can, I'll get it even above kind of 200, so that it's in no way kind of conflicting with body of the snare, because that is obviously very prevalent in drum and bass. But I've rolled it off pretty hard. It's about 160, and then this area here, low mid in vocals, really important to make sure that isn't too prevalent. If it is, your vocals are going to be really boxy, and nobody really likes a boxy vocal. It just doesn't sound nice. So we notch out quite a lot of the low mids, and it's not something you want in dance. In certainly in a drum and bass record, low mid is a kind of problem area. Elements can be there, but it's not something you want an abundance of. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't sound very nice. And I guess I'm notching out. It's nothing too extreme. maximum about -4 dB, and most of that would have been, as I'd said earlier, in the recording setup. It wasn't the best ideal room to record the vocals, so there was a lot of flight cases around. It was a very confined, hard kind of brick room. We dampened it as best we could, but something in that room, the modes of the room or something, was bringing out the kind of low mids quite a lot, and it gets cut further down the chain as well. And then we've got the upper mids here, sort of 1.5K all the way through to just over 3K. That's kind of the presence of the vocal. That's to some extent, it's not the body, but it's the power in the vocal. It's the bit that we kind of, the human ear really latches onto in vocals and probably in speech as well. So that area again is very, very important to kind of get right. And if you've got too much of it, it puts people off really quickly. So you've got to kind of keep that reined in. But if you chop it too much, it starts to sound, especially this area here, the upper mids, if you chop it too much, it starts to sound really unnatural. And because everybody is so attuned to hearing the voice, the human voice, whether it's speaking, singing, or whatever. As human beings, we're used to hearing it. If you make it sound unnatural, it immediately attracts the ear. So that area you've got to be pretty careful with and make sure you're not doing anything too crazy, too severe, because it puts people off quite quickly, even if it's kind of an unconscious thing. Yeah, so
It doesn't matter what they say.
I was going to show you
It doesn't matter.
a little cool thing with this, which another producer had shown me. With this
It
EQ,
doesn't matter what they
when it
say.
plays back and you've got the spectrum analyzer in the background,
It doesn't matter what they say.
when it goes purple, I'll see if I can
It
do it.
doesn't matter what they say.
You can hold it and pull
Through the
down,
floor,
and it will
Santa.
notch out what you're trying to,
It doesn't matter what they say.
if I can do it.
It doesn't matter what they say.
So it's not working.
It doesn't matter what they say.
There we go. Look. So I can
Through
take
the floor, Santa.
that peak
Through
there
the
that I could
cabling.
see was a problem, and I can bring it down, or I can take
But I won't be
this peak up
confined by
here
the regimented
and
borders.
just grab it. If I can play it back
It doesn't matter what they say.
and grab that peak, and I'm like, I really
Through
need
the
to bring
floor,
that
Santa.
specific
Through the
frequency down. I
cabling.
want to notch it out, and I can just drag that down.
But I won't be confined by the regimented borders.
And I just thought that was a really cool kind of forward-thinking way of combining an analyzer with interactive EQing. And I didn't realise it had done that. It's a little, you know, as you could see, it's a little bit kind of hit and miss grabbing it. But when you're trying to make surgical cuts and you really just want that specific frequency and only that frequency, it's really, really good for that. So that's the EQing down to there. And then what else do we have? Another compressor. So this is the Tube Tech. This would have been off the Power Core. And this is an opto compressor. Optos are really good for vocals. They're kind of slow and smooth. They don't deal with hard transients. They're about fattening and warming. And I found that this one in particular is great on vocals. Another one you could use is something like the LA2A, which is a classic kind of opto compressor. But I found that this one, I will try different compressors as I go, because vocals respond completely differently to different compressors. So one compressor might work brilliantly on a vocalist, and then you try it on the next vocalist and it's like, that's completely wrong. It doesn't do the same thing. But opto compression in general, because of the way it works, it uses a photo cell and a light bulb. So basically, the brighter the light bulb, the more light is received by the photo cell, and it applies more compression. That's kind of how it works. You'd think light being fast, it would be fast compression, but it's soft and steady. So I like to kind of use dynamics and not like use one compressor and smash the vocal with one compressor. I like to use stages of compression. I find it more controllable, and it provides a more natural sound, really. So next up, another great FabFilter plugin, the multi-band, and this is just again taking going back to the low mids and the high mids. This is just dealing with those problem areas again, but in a more transparent kind of way. Rather than notching more EQ out and making it sound unnatural, I'm going to just duck those frequencies a little bit when they hit a threshold that I've defined as too much. And it's quite subtle, but it does
What they say! What they say!
Let's bring that one in as well.
Through the floors and through the cabling, they're permeating it through every single day. But I won't be confused. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't matter what they say.
So I don't know if this will translate or not, but in here you can hear that that's kind of just dipping the low mids. It's pretty subtle, but it does, over the course of the track, and the more layers we bring in, make a massive difference. So I will get my EQ and compression and de-essing and dynamics all set up on my main vocal. That's what I work on first. The vocal that's, you know, primarily in the center of the mix. It's the thing that people listen to. That has to be right, and I'll get that set first. If I haven't got that set, I won't move on to any other parts. It's got to be right. One of the reasons for doing that is I can then, in Cubase, I'll copy those channel settings and I will then put them onto, for instance, the next thing that we're going to look at is the doubles. I'll use that as a kind of base template of EQ and compression, if you like. I will adjust it to fit the part, but it gives me a really good sort of starting point. It's a bit of a time saver, really. You've just got to be careful that you don't kind of put it on everything and expect it to work. You do have to tweak the stuff to the individual part. So if we now look at the doubles that come in here.
Won't be confined by the regimented borders. Won't be confined by the regimented borders.
So we're getting a doubling effect. Now that will be,
Won't be confined.
in this case, it's just two parts, two recordings, double tracked, but they're kept pan centered to add body. And then I think, I've used some kind of synthetic ADT, automatic double tracking, to kind of give it some width, rather than panning hard left and hard right. Sometimes this sounds better and sometimes the other way sounds better. This has a slightly more chorused synthetic effect. When you just do double takes and you pan hard left and hard right, it's much more organic sound. It's much more sort of traditional recording technique. This makes it sound slightly more synthy, which can work really well.
Won't be confined by the regimented borders. We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers. We're not. Won't be confined by the 50,000.
So if you listen to that part,
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers.
no doubling.
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers. We're not.
So you can hear the kind of aliasing and chorusing effect, but you know, in certain scenarios, I think that's a benefit rather than, as some may see it, as a kind of, you know, a problem. So they're core elements that go into it. These low vocals that we talked about earlier sounded very kind of basic and normal, but
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers.
they're really crucial to this kind of body and thickening of his vocal. And again, I've used a lot of the processing that I developed for the main vocal, and then I will have changed the EQ slightly, and there's another compressor in there. Or in fact, that's a soft clipper, T-Rack soft clipper, which we use a lot. I use it not so much in this project, but I have used it an awful lot. Just again, as Leon described, it just kind of simulates overdriven analog circuitry and the clipping of a waveform, so in a soft, fattening way rather than digital, which you wouldn't want. It sounds awful. But yeah, this works well. And a little bit of distortion from Saturn in here.
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers.
Not doing a huge amount. Again, building layers of stuff, compression, EQ, distortion, doing it in stages, I found much more controllable and than kind of taking one plugin and hammering it to give me a sound. I never really got the sound I wanted. I found using different little bits from different plugins would give me a more kind of credible sound for it.
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers when I do.
So it's rolling off the low as well there,
50,000 soldiers.
which is something I will tend to do in backing vocals, and anything that's not the main vocal, I will get rid of quite a lot of the low end just to give the main vocal more space, but as a whole to help the vocal fit into what is essentially, it's a pretty busy mix.
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers.
So together you'll get this.
We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers. We're not duty bound to anybody's orders.
Which in the record kind of sounds like one vocal, but there's a lot of thought and time and energy gone into making that one singer that you're hearing sound thick and the right amount of aggression in there, right amount of distortion and edge comes from lots of stages of recording and lots of stages of EQ and compression. And then into the mix we'll add in the screams. Again, same sort of setup with the EQ and compression. Probably a touch more distortion. Well, it looks, yeah, a little bit. Looks kind of similar. But again, yeah, I'm just within the screams needing to kind of rein in the sort of 2 to what looks nearly 5K region, just to dip it out, because the scream is quite a different thing to a sung note.
Regiments and borders. We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers. We're not duty bound to anybody's orders.
So that is,
Regiments and borders.
and that's panned hard left and hard right. That's a very stereo thing. That's again, it's a kind of exciting aural experience. It's those kind of distorted frequencies that Ollie's making with his voice. They're different in either speaker, and it's kind of, yeah, it's exciting the ear, which is part of our job to make the vocal interesting and hold your attention. Harmonies. A good point here really is in this project will be the point at which we start structuring the vocal. So we'll start deciding what vocals go where, what parts that we've recorded are in and out, and that's something that, as I say, it evolves over time in conjunction with the main project that's running along. But I'm pretty sure with the harmonies, they're probably not, yeah, they don't come in until later on, much later on down here.
Won't be confined by the regimented borders. We got the strength of over 50,000 soldiers.
Yeah, so the harmonies are just kind of, they're just in at the kind of midway point and the end point. Those are decisions that we make here in conjunction with the final mix project, as I said earlier. And finally, but not to be missed, is the samples of rapping and things that we had recorded previously, I think even for a different track. But we'd done what we did with some of the guitar sounds, and we'd looped them up and edited them and cut them to kind of create this vocal kind of rap hook, really. And that's what you can
What you wanna do, what you wanna do, what you wanna do, don't let them run you. What you wanna do, what you wanna do, what you wanna do, don't let them run you. Do what you wanna do what you wanna.
Now, I can't show you the project that these were made in because I'm pretty sure it doesn't exist anymore. But it was a combination of pitch shifting and messing around with things, sort of different types of delay and grain delay and things like that. So that's how that was made. A bit of filtering on the intro. But it just shows you that, we look, as well as doing a dedicated session for a track, often the other element of the vocals will have come from somewhere completely different. And it's an ethos that we have about how we compose and how we put tracks together, but it runs all the way through from as you saw earlier, guitars, vocals, and samples of drums, as Leon and Dan were explaining earlier. So it's a technique. It's more than a technique for us. It's a way of producing. That sampling element is still incredibly important to us. So yeah, that concludes this this part of the vocals.
So bringing it all together, just wanted to talk about the mix and how these parts are fitted together once they're in the final project. So the guitar and the vocals, for example, were mixed independently to sound good independently of everything else, and then stemmed and put into the final mix project. And then we've just got to make some changes across the board to fit it all together. When I'm mixing, I tend not to pretend like as if I can't change any of these parts and just mix with what I've got in front of me, because it's always tempting to either remove or change any part which screws up the sonics of the track. But you can't always be that idealistic. If you want guitars and strings and you've got certain vocal recordings, you have to work with what you've got. Otherwise you end up taking out everything from the track except your favorite synth, your sub and your drums, which is great. That's the way to make an awesome sounding dance record. But we are also trying to make like a live sound and a raw sound and use those particular elements people are going to see live. So you've got to fit it all together based on what you've got. Start with the drums and get them to a level that you're happy with. If we solo the drums, we can see over here in the analyzer that we've got a decent level of the entire drum beat. That looks like a drum beat that you might bring up as a single sample. And you want those playing out at a decent level. I think there's going to be a little bit of clipping that happens on the output. We're going to 2-0. Don't worry about that too much. You know, let Cubase clip. It sounds good. There's an enormous amount of headroom on every channel and every group because it's 32-bit floating points. So that I don't know how much headroom that gives you, but it's more than is physically possible to recreate in the physical world. So it's just the output that you've got to really worry about. And you want to keep it reasonable, but don't worry about a little bit of clipping. On a track that's got distortion, no one's going to notice, and it's going to give you a nice loud sound. So once you've got the drums in, the next loudest thing that's going to take up the most space is probably your sub. So bring that in. There's not much we can do with that in terms of EQ. And that's kind of peaking at around -6 on the meter. Depends on what instrument you're using as to where you'll set the fader for that. So it's best to look at these figures here, which show you exactly how loud the output of a thing is. And it's going to vary. There'll be a few peaks here and there, but we're just like a little bit louder than -6 on that sub. We're keeping the output quite quiet. So then we've got to bring in all these tracks that have got extra mid. The drums have gone through soft clippers that I've already talked about. Here's that one's on the kick. This one's on the drum output channel. So there's lots of little layers of this soft clipper, just bringing it brings the volume up, cuts the dynamics off the top a bit like a compressor, but it also tends to add a bit of harmonics in mid. They're very simple, but don't be afraid to use lots of them because they sound great in the final mix. So if I unmute that, unsolo that, and look at some of the other elements going into this. We'll do the vocals last. So the guitars, for example, they've already been EQ'd to sound like a guitar, but we're going to have to do quite a lot more in order to get them into our mix with all the synths and basses and stuff. A huge amount of EQ on here. You've got to be careful not to make them sound too unnatural, but at the same time, as long as we balance that out with the synth instrument that we've got up here, it rebalances the low end of the guitar and makes it sound a bit more natural. You can hear there's that bass guitar frequency put back in. And again, we're using Bit Crusher in this case to make sure that the parts dynamically aren't jumping about too much. You'll see quite a flat wave over here in the oscilloscope. So even with those two parts together, it's very controllable. We're not getting any unusual spikes or peaks, and that's because Liam did a great job in sort of compressing it and getting the whole sound very even when we put the stems in the project. So that makes, you can't fix it all in the mix. You just can't. You've got to start with good sounds. So if I add the whole guitar in fact, we've cut out a hell of a lot of low mid from the guitars. You can see over here in the spectrum analyzer that there's still a lot of low mid going on in this track, more than you'd normally have in a dance track, but it makes things sound pretty fat and warm, and that's also a consideration with this track. We want warmth and a kind of analog sound. Similar things going on with the vocal. We've got two vocal stems that Liam's given me here. The first one is the dry. They're gonna take it all away! And the EQ on that. We've got another de-esser going on because it's quite a good idea to take high out and then kind of boost that later on. You know, the high will add up, and the microphone was quite sparkly to begin with. So we can have a touch more de-essing on there, and just some peaks to take out any extra boxiness we don't want in the 200, and I've taken out some extra nearly 3K at the top there, because in Ollie's voice that would sound quite harsh on a sound system. As I say, didn't need to do much because we've been through the pre-production on these vocals already. Separate stem of the effects allows me to balance very quickly all the nice effects Liam's done against the dry. If we want it more dry or more affected, that's just a couple of fader clicks away. And added to all those frequencies, we've got the strings come in, and they're pretty big in this part of the track. When we go into the strings, you'll see a similar thing happening again with the EQ. The reason there's so much cut here, it might seem a bit unusual, but with the Fab filter, we're now using the Pro Q2, but this is the Pro Q1, older project. The reason that there's so much cut is because it's always a better idea to cut EQ and then boost volume. If you get into EQ boosts with this many channels, I think what we got here, 90 channels going on, you're going to run into trouble. So cut EQ, boost volume. There's a huge amount of boost on this. It's turned out 20 dB. But that's fine because it started off quite quiet. And again, this is just to reduce all the boxiness we can out of the strings, because naturally live sounds are going to have quite a roomy, middly focus, so that the strings stand out. Again, dynamically, not too much jumping around there on the oscilloscope. So even when those are in a really busy mix, when they come in, they shouldn't drown. And then we're adding into all that the vocals at the end. And there's a fair bit of stereo on the vocals. Obviously, the higher up the mix you go, the more stereo you can go. Vocals are fairly high up in the mix, and we want them to have a really nice, wide, lush sound. So we've got some stereo in those. Stereo is a great way to help things stand out from the mix without just making them louder and louder and louder. But at the same time, if you do too much of it, you're going to get in trouble on any device that's just got one speaker or a mono sound system. There's various times you can lose a lot of your mix. So general rule is just make sure that your sub is entirely mono and the stereo image gets wider as you go up the track. And in this case, we've done that by isolating each set of instruments into their own main frequency. So the guitars are sort of low mid to mid, and the vocal is kind of mid to high mid, and then we've got risers and cymbals and things that are very stereo up in the top end. Other ways of doing it is, of course, to use like a stereo imager plugin, preferably a multi-band one, but we haven't had to do too much of that fixing in this mix. Nothing is too loud. We're not just pushing the volume of things up and up and up, because it's all got to sit behind those drums, and it's got to allow some headroom. If we get to the end and we need to turn the sub up a couple of dB, we've got to be able to do that without just completely distorting the whole track. So yeah, there's no rocket science to this mix at all. It's all EQ cuts, volume boosts, carefully examining the stereo, and generally keeping any parts which you don't want at the front of the mix down in the kind of -18, -20 kind of volume range on their faders. Yeah, the end result is the track that you can go and see on YouTube, Run You. So thanks for watching. You can listen to the track Run You. It's on the Warrior Sound album, which is available on Spotify, the videos on YouTube, or you can follow us on any of our social media at The Qemists. That's Qemists. See you soon.